Welcome back to the Diamond View podcast. I am your co-host Joseph Sag, and along with me as always is Baxter Webb. Today we have a unique show for you, one that I don't think has been properly addressed in the business world, and that's Net Promoter Score. Most businesses use it. I'm not sure if we're using it correctly or if it's giving us accurate data and insights. Baxter, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, Joe. In my last couple startups, we've used Net Promoter Score. It's been kind of the gospel for us. It's something we've tracked week to week. We tout it in our decks and presentations to customers about how much our brands love us or our customers love us, and we certainly presented it to. What's that?
Or don't love us.
Or don't love us. Yeah, I mean that's. Hope I get you're probably not touting that, but that's certainly out there. And it was part of what we presented to our investors as well, to track that over time. And it's historically had this kind of aura around it of being predictive of growth. Really interesting history behind it. But then the article that we're going to talk a little bit about today came out of Elon College and some professors there, and maybe really made me start to question what I have long held as gospel around Net Promoter Score.
Great. I mean, let's before we introduce the article, let's really clearly define what is Net Promoter Score at a high level. Actually, you're probably better at articulating this than I am.
Yeah, no, I mean, so interesting history. It kind of came out of Bain and Company, so one of the big three consulting firms, top consulting firms in the country. A researcher there that focused on customer loyalty and satisfaction named Frank Reichheld had a big consultancy practice around this and developed this metric. It was published in the Harvard Business Review in 2003, where he touted it as the only metric you need to know. And with that backing of HBR and Bain and Company, man, did it take off. And some of the biggest brands in the country still track this, right? Tesla, Apple, Best Buy, Delta, Amazon, Netflix, everybody tracks it. It's part of all of their communications. Like, people's compensation is determined off of Net Promoter Score. But almost immediately, as soon as this article in HBR came out, kind of the academic side of the business world really started to attack it. If you look at the number of academic studies that have been done on this in like the last 20 years since it was introduced, 181,000 hits. To put that in perspective, there are more studies done on Net Promoter Score in the last 20 years than there have been on prostate cancer. That's bananas, right? Just absolutely bananas. And really, academia in the academic business world has hated on Net Promoter Score and just said, the touting of it as the one metric you need to know. Really, it supposedly it predicts growth. All of that is false. And so just kind of article after article about it. And yet everybody still uses it. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about how it's calculated. And then get into kind of what's a good one, what's a bad NPS, and then we'll kind of start to unwind the criticisms, and then finally we'll talk about what actually can we do with NPS.
It's trying to quantify customer feelings towards a brand.
It is, yeah. I mean, so it's if you're familiar with the Likert scale, like a 10-point scale, and it's how likely are you to recommend X company to other people. Like it's a very simple question that you send out via a survey to your current users historically. And how likely is it that you'd recommend our company to a friend or colleague? And a 10 is...
It classifies it in three different ways: promoters, passives, and detractors. You have to get between a 9 and a 10 to be a promoter, which is your best of the best score. Passives 7 to 8. Detractors, anything 6 and below.
That's right. And then the Net Promoter Score is your promoters less your detractors, and then you divide that by the total number of survey respondents that you have. You get a decimal that you multiply by 100, and then that gives you a score. So a score of 0 means that you have more promoters than detractors. That's a good thing. 0 to 30 as a score is generally considered good. 30 to 70 is great. And 70 to 100 is excellent. Joe, you want to talk about some of like the historical NPSs that are out there for various companies?
Well, I can talk to you about my experience with it, and both of our careers go back, predate Net Promoter Score. I clearly remember seeing the evolution of how to quantify this data from customer surveys to what it is now, and it's evolved. But really, the Net Promoter Score is really ranking how likely is it would you recommend our company to a friend or colleague. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And I think it is good data, but I also question the validity of it because how are they collecting this data? Website surveys, email surveys is probably the most popular. And I get emails all the time asking me to take surveys. How did we do? And you can just clearly see they're asking these defined Net Promoter Score questions. And I really don't take the surveys.
There's absolutely going to be response bias, right? Like the people that are likely to take it are going to have strong feelings. And so you're probably, yeah, you do have some response bias that comes in with it.
At one company that I worked for, we would send these out. And I was surprised by it. It was a B2B company, and I was surprised by the lack of response. Actually, I wasn't surprised because if I put myself in their shoes, why would I want to take the time to do this when I'm so busy on everything else? It's basically helping out another company. I mean, you position it to say your feedback is important to us to help us improve the client experience and help serve you better. But
Yep.
I do question, like you said, the response bias.
Yeah, well, and the percentage of people that actually respond is probably just as telling as the overall NPS that you generate as well. But it's interesting. Like Tesla, as recently as last year, had a NPS of like 97. Like that's off the charts, high, and yet their growth is stalled. Like you've heard all of the problems that they've had as of late. Things like Starbucks, Amazon, they're in the 70s. Netflix and Apple are historically in the 60s. And really what's come out is that it's not predictive of your growth as a firm. Joe, I think you're starting to hit on like one area where there's breakdown in the score. But there's also another disconnect because just because you're indicating on a survey that you're likely to recommend or that you would recommend, do you actually go and engage in that action? Like, do you go recommend it to other people? And does your recommendation actually matter to other people? So we kind of looked at a couple of other interesting studies out there, some things that are interesting. 29% of online critical remarks were from individuals who rated a company a 7 or an 8. So those are like your neutral people. And yet almost a third of all negative remarks online about a company are coming from these neutral people or passives, right? Not really that passive if they're actually posting online negative things about you. And so again, there's some kind of response bias, some kind of issue with how people are responding to that survey and then what they actually do online. A couple other interesting things. So women are much more likely to engage in positive word of mouth, and men are more likely to engage in negative word of mouth. Joe, thinking about your wife, what kind of
I would wholeheartedly agree. That is something that, but I think about the brands that my wife is attached to as opposed to what I'm attached to. I am a brand fanatic of only a few different brands out there. One,
Yep.
my Hoka shoes, my running shoes. Two, that I drive an FJ Cruiser. It's 15 years old. I love that thing. But those are just a couple. But have I ever taken a survey?
Well, how about the
on
Tennessee
those?
Vols? And
Well,
Sinatra is
I
not
don't.
so much a big fan of your promoter either.
Yeah, that's right. But I think about those brands that I am a brand advocate for. My data is, and my feedback is really not getting quantifiable or back to them because I just enjoy the brands and I don't want to. I don't know if I've ever received anything as far as feedback from them.
Well, and it's interesting, Joe. Like, I don't know that you and I have ever talked about Hoka shoes before.
I don't think we have either.
So, I mean, right there, right? Yeah, so they're interesting. And again, I guess that gets back to like men are less likely to engage in positive word of mouth than women, and kind of reinforces that. Really interesting. There are also some cultural aspects to this as well. So, like cultures, if you have a worldwide business or thinking about other markets, so culture that kind of embrace unpredictability and uncertainty are more likely to engage in word of mouth. So like the US, we're one of those cultures that's more likely to embrace that. The United Kingdom, India, surprisingly China is as well. But then on the other end, you've got countries like Korea, Italy, Mexico, Russia, that don't really embrace uncertainty. And so those cultures are much more likely to write reviews that are really insightful and detailed, but more likely to be extreme and negative. And so, yeah, it really interesting, right? So it doesn't predict growth. Almost universally, every study in the academic literature has said that Net Promoter Score does not predict growth. So does it hold any value? Well, of course, Bain and company, being the big consultancy that they are, aren't going to just sit idly on the sidelines and just let their attack get crapped all over by academia. And so they've actually gone back and adjusted this. And I think this is interesting, right? Because Tesla, their Net Promoter Score is 97. They're asking current customers it. What they're now saying is that you have to go ask the entire market what they think of your brand. And that's what's predictive of growth. And that kind of makes sense to me, right? So like if you were to go out and ask everybody about Tesla and their responses about it, I'm sure that 97 NPS would actually drop really dramatically and would probably be a much better predictor of what's going to happen with Tesla. So really interesting when you think about it that way. What do you think, Joe?
Well, I think a lot of those insights were uncovered in the article, which we didn't formally introduce. It's Unlocking Sales Success, Decoding Net Promoter Scores, Categories, and Buyer Repurchase Intentions.
Yep.
And I think you're hitting on the main points of the criticisms here.
Yeah, no, and what I will say is that this revised approach from Bain and Frank Reichheld has been validated by academic researchers. It's called a brand health Net Promoter Score. That actually is being found to be predictive of growth. So it's not just kind of a concept; it's actually like validated there, and really interesting how that's come around. Now, what I will say is actually figuring out how to do a wide study of an entire customer segment, not just your current customers, but all your potential customers, sounds like something you would have to engage a consultant for in order to do. So lo and behold, that still comes back to benefit Bain and Company somehow, interestingly, but really interesting there. But I think it's also interesting to think about other ways of doing this that maybe don't require you to go out and interact with people that aren't your customers. There's certainly health in that, but there are some other approaches in academia that have helped validate maybe easier approaches to do this, including using the exact same question and just looking at the rate of your promoters. So not even worrying about detractors, not worrying about passives, but only looking at the percentage of customers who rate you a 9 or a 10 is that actually is predictive of growth. So that kind of promoter percentage score, you can still use the same format. You can still just ask your customers. And if you just look at the percentage of 9s and 10s rating, that's highly predictive. I would argue, Joe, and I'd love your thoughts on this. Like, I think it's probably even more worthwhile to break out the percentage of people rating you a 10 and the percentage of people rating you a 9. I imagine that would differentially predict it as well. But kind of what do you think there?
Well, yes, but I would also say, when you're dealing with data on a massive scale like that, such as like a Tesla, and you're looking at 9 or 10, even getting more granular in that perspective, what does that look like? Because you mentioned, the difference between me and my wife's perspectives. What do those segments of those 9 and 10s look like? Is it weighted heavily 90% towards women demographics as opposed to men? If so,
Yep.
then it's not really giving you an accurate reflection of those who those 9 and 10s are.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, so then kind of coming back full circle to the article we teased at the beginning from researchers at Elon. I guess it's university now. They've upgraded from the college status. But they looked at a database of $3 billion in business to business sales, covered 31 sales in 31 distinct U.S. states, and these were kind of larger B2B sales. So the average annual contract value was a little bit over $5 million. And they longitudinally tracked NPS to see if it was predictive of whether these B2B sales would renew the contracts each year. So not just looking at kind of overall growth of the company, but more specifically looking at renewals. And here's what they found. So of the people that were promoters, 91.2% renewed their deal. So there were 8% or so that opted not to renew it. 80% essentially of customers that were in the neutral category, so a 7 or 8, the passives, they renewed. Almost a 3/4 renewal, or essentially a 3/4 renewal rate in the passives. And then what's surprising, in the detractor category, over 50%, 52.1% still renewed. So kind of a little bit surprising to me, Joe. I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I think it's surprising, but not surprising at the same time. I mean,
Yeah, it makes sense, right? Like the overall trend is what you would expect. Kind of surprised that there's 8% drop off of firms that were your promoters that don't renew, and maybe that's like
that's high or
financial
low?
difficulties. I think it's low. I mean, I don't know, 8% of people that would highly recommend you don't renew.
Do you think that takes into consideration budget requirements, budget constraints, or
Well, and that's where I mean, like it could be like financial difficulties of the firm or something like that. But I don't know. I guess I was a little bit surprised that it wasn't above 95% renewing on that end, and I was surprised it was as high as 50% in people that like aren't that passive. I guess there's like the stickiness factor where it's difficult to rip some things out even when you're not satisfied. But I was surprised the 50% was as high as it was. I was surprised the 91%. It was just a little bit lower than I would have suspected.
right? I agree. So moving along, Baxter, I really want to understand and how it compares to my career, your career to my career. But when you would send out the surveys, what kind of response
Yep.
rate did you get from your customers?
It was variable. I mean, over time, and a lot, they're different. How quickly you send it out to people relative to when you have an interaction with them determines response rate, and kind of when you serve it up in the course of a day and a week can also impact it. But we were good weeks. We were in the 60% of a response rate there.
I think that's high, honestly, because
Yeah.
my background or my history says lower. Anywhere from 35%. Could be higher depending on whether I was working for a large company or a small company, but it was lower than 60% in my history.
Yeah, and it's worth calling out to the medium that you serve it up with.
Right.
So, do you send it via an email? Do you send it via a text message? In our case, we had an app, and so when people were coming into the app, we were able to push a pop, almost like a pop up into the app to ask them, and they could. It would force the user to like close out of the pop up, and so it was just as easy for them to actually rate it in that situation, which is I think why we had such a good response rate. But that's certainly worth thinking about as you think about how to design, is Net Promoter Score the right thing for you? And then if it is, what's the right way to design it so that you can A, get good response rates, and then B, produce actionable results off of it? And I think that's like an interesting question. So like if your score is low, if you're not where you want to be, especially if you don't have like the high 9s and 10s, what are the common reasons for that, and how do you think about going to tackle it? I'm curious, Joe. What do you think are like? Where would you start to push and investigate if you saw a low net promoter score?
I think there's ways to improve your net promoter score. One, is identify a net promoter score champion at your company. Someone who owns it from start to finish and is responsible for the data that it provides and effectively communicates it across all levels of the organization. Because getting everybody aligned is going to be critical in helping you not only from the sales aspect, but from the onboarding and the service aspect. So having that one person take accountability and ownership of it is critical. Two, you got to listen
Love
to the
that.
needs of your customers. That is
But let me go back to that first point. But think about the silo, like marketing, sales, product, customer. The person that you have own NPS oversight. Where do you fit them in the organization?
in the banking industry, when I worked for large banks, they had various names for it, calling it the one bank champion, high level executive position, but there was a whole department to help break down those silos in your commercial, your business banking, your retail, your wealth management, because one person can overlap into all those different verticals or
Yep.
departments in there. Having someone who's independent, whose sole job is to break down those silos and bring everybody to the table, essentially. I
Yep.
think at smaller companies, it's going to be different. You don't have the budget to create a whole department for bringing everybody together. So that's up to the leadership team to really hone in on this and
Yep.
make it part of your daily routine. So those are my thoughts. I think there's different approaches depending on the size of your organization.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Like, I mean, I could see an argument being made for having the chief operating officer own it in some roles. A chief revenue or growth officer would make a lot of sense, and
I
that
agree with
chief
that.
growth yeah, chief growth officer is such like a popular concept in startups right now. That would seem like a really natural place to have it be owned. And then as your organization gets bigger, I think you're right. You got to think about cross departmental collaboration and almost like a committee that starts to own it in a lot of ways to be able to align the organization effectively. Yeah. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I thought
No,
that
I
was
think there's other ways to improve your net promoter score. The most clear and obvious, I think, is listening to the needs of your customers. What are they actually saying? And that doesn't just go back to the surveys that they're filling out. Do some social listening. Go online, see what they're talking about your industry and your brand is itself. I think the next one I think is reducing your net promoter score killing task. So how often have you called into your credit card company and you had to verify your identity? They couldn't solve your problem. Then they transfer you to somebody else, and then you have to verify your identity again. And
yep.
you may have even started by verifying your identity through by pressing the buttons and going through the phone screening process, and then the service reps ask you for it again. It happens to me all the time, and it's just a big frustration for me. But those are net
To be
promoter
fair,
scores.
though, you seem like somebody that should have to identify their identity
Yeah,
multiple times. Like
I am a
you're
little
kind of sketchy if
sketchy.
you're calling into a
I am
bank.
sketchy.
Yeah.
So I think reducing those net promoter score killing task, and then just asking for feedback. And I know we talk about doing it at scale through the digital channels. That's the easiest and most effective way, but we've got to listen to our customers on a one-on-one, human-to-human basis and collect that data and feedback, quantify it, and incorporate it into our metrics somehow, some way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think you hit the big ones, right? Like it's customer service, it's product development. I think there's also like a piece around sales, like making sure that what your salespeople are actually selling is something that you can live up to and deliver on. And so having an aligned process there. And then during the customer onboarding, I think you got to make sure that you have your KPIs lined up and are thinking about how you actually demonstrate that you're delivering on the things. It's like the telling people what you're going to do, then and then doing it and then telling them what you did. Like just reinforcing that kind of loop is interesting. And then one of the interesting things that was kind of in a different article that was out there around Net Promoter Score is that what other people say about your company can impact the score that others give. So like if I said Hoka sucked, then you might all of a sudden go from being a 10 down to an 8 just because of that peer-to-peer. I mean, it's not going to happen, right?
Right.
Mostly how much you go off Hoka, but there's enough of like that kind of like societal peer pressure that it can be impactful. And so like actually understanding who your detractors are and trying to either, win them over or neutralize the negative impact they have. That seems like an important part of like brand management for your overall company as well.
I think this has been a very insightful conversation, eye-opening for me just to dive into it and really take a step back and pick it apart.
Well, I have one more question for you, Joe. Kind of a theoretical issue. So we talked about Net Promoter Score and how it's traditionally calculated with your customer base. But then there's the brand health Net Promoter Score where you go out and you segment all potential customers. I think it's a really interesting scenario. Like if you have a disconnect where your brand health NPS is much lower than the NPS of your customer base. So you could think about like the Tesla example there. I would guess. What do you do about that? Like what strategies would you think about, especially as I think to me, it's more of a marketing thing, but like, how do you think about, how do you think about that as a marketer? What would you do to close the gap between what your customers believe about you and know about you and what the broader market does?
I think you really have to look at your marketing strategies and your marketing messages. What brand awareness techniques are you using? What marketing channels are you using to speak to the audience who can be potential customers? Because let's face it, if they're not an ideal customer or fit that profile for your product or service, do you really even care? But on the flip side, do they impact you negatively to the point where it's going to cost you ideal customers coming to you? So I really think it goes back to your marketing, your messaging, who you're speaking to, and the tactics that you're using to get your message out there.
Yeah, no, I think that's fat. I love what you said because it's almost like we need to look at our user personas, and is the user persona that's adopting our product and giving us such a high NPS dramatically different from the user personas that are not adopting our product and have a lower brand health, NPS. And if there's like no reason for them to be dramatically different, then I think you have to that's an amazing time to think about marketing and using the power of your customer's voice and how much they love you, and like webinars and refer a friend program, things like that to like be able to really catalyze on the positive NPS that you've generated in your customer base. But to your point, like maybe there are good reasons that people like Tesla's probably a great example of that, right? Where the people that have bought a Tesla really buy into that lifestyle and that mindset and that value base. And there's a whole nother segment out there that just doesn't value that the same way. And so it wouldn't make sense in that situation to kind of try to double down and use it. I think you have to think about new product development, and other things like that to address a different part of the market that your current product offering doesn't address.
We've talked a lot about Tesla. Just for the audience to know, my wife just bought a Tesla a few months ago, and every car she's had, the last two cars she had before that, I hated them, but I really enjoy her Tesla. I think she bought it because she just doesn't want to go to the gas station anymore, but it is a fun car to drive, and it's mind blowing the technology that they put into it. It's still no FJ Cruiser, but it is a lot of fun to drive.
Now, had you been, how much is your like value or how much you appreciate Tesla changed since you've had the exposure of her having the car?
Greatly.
Yeah.
I'd never driven.
So like that's an interesting piece too. Like it's almost like, do you give people, like you think about like cars, right? Like come like get it for a weekend and drive it and let people actually appreciate the benefits in a low risk way. I think there's some like interesting things that you can think about from a marketing standpoint to if your product is something that people are going to love once they get it, then that opens up one playbook. And then there's probably another playbook you have to go to if there is truly different user segmentation and kind of needs and values.
So let's wrap this up, Baxter.
Yep.
Of course, we always have the last segment of our show as the home run. What is the key takeaway here? So Baxter, home run time. What's your home run?
For me, I'm going to go a little bit more meta on this, just so we don't have another situation where we both have the same home run and a grand slam. Yeah. Kind of, I've been reading. Yeah, I've been reading Adam Grant's book, Think Again, and really what this article and this kind of whole episode has made me really do is question some of the things that I've held as gospel in business. And Net Promoter Score was something that like I didn't even really question, and I'm wondering like what are other things that I should be questioning and thinking more deeply about, and not just addressing as gospel. And it's almost like following the Pied Piper, right? Like Net Promoter Score at its core, and what's kind of come out with these articles is that it's a little bit of a Pied Piper, and you're following the wrong thing and not really thinking deeply about the metrics that you use, and especially like in a startup kind of world where you have your levers and your rocks and your trying to optimize around certain things. Are you optimizing around the right things? That's kind of my takeaway from this episode.
I think you have to go beyond Net Promoter Score and dive deeper. I think Net Promoter Score needs to be a tool in your tool belt, one that you're measuring, looking at, but seeing it for its true picture or piece of the puzzle in the grand scheme of things. But I think you have to dive deeper into what's really going on by looking at customer lifetime value and actually tracking client referrals. So, every company I've worked for, we have a field in our CRM, whether it's Salesforce or HubSpot, whatever, that says how did this client get acquired? And this was in B2B. And there's always a field for client referral. And there's always a place that you can expand on that and list who the client was. So looking at customer lifetime value, how long are they staying with you? How often do they purchase from you? And track the actual client referrals. That's real data. That is real revenue to your bottom line. And then are you seeing the growth over time and the correlation between Net Promoter Score, customer lifetime value, client referrals? And that would tell me not solely rely on NPS, but just look at the other data that you have available that a lot of companies are just overlooking.
I think that's great. Yeah, and I don't think I can have two home runs. I'm not that much of an MVP to be able to pull off two home runs in a game, but I do think it's interesting to think about, if you think about customer retention and how important it is for like driving growth in your organization to keep customers and have a base of revenue that you can continue to add new customers to and grow. understanding a little bit more about your customer situation and what's going to lead them to renew, like having better signal there that your customer service team can then kind of cue off of and think about, like, to our point, or what we were talking about earlier, where there was over 8% of companies in the 9 or 10 motor category that didn't renew. How do you better understand what's really going on there to get them to renew more? Do you need to adjust your pricing because they're going through something financially in the short term? Or are there other things that you're not understanding, like dynamics inside an organization that you have to expound upon? I think figuring out ways to have better signal to try to retain business is a really interesting concept.
I agree. Baxter, I think this has been a great discussion today. Again, thank you for your insights. Thank you for bringing this article to my attention, to the audience's attention. And It has been a fun conversation.
I've loved it. And let's talk about like what's on deck. So our next article, our next episode, a really interesting article that a group of 3 researchers from across Europe looked at a number of business-to-business transportation firms and how do you strategically align marketing, sales, IT, and leadership to drive customer success. To this latter point or what we were just talking about, how do you retain customers and really build your growth by having that retained customer base? What's the strategy there? They developed a really interesting framework that look forward to discussing with you next time, Joe.
This brings a smile to my face because that is a topic so near and dear to my heart. So Baxter, thank you. For anyone listening, if you want to submit a question or if you want to submit a topic for us to discuss, just email me at saig@metanos.com, metonos.com. Thank you guys. Till next time. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Diamond View Show. We hope you found our discussion on business strategies both insightful and inspiring. Remember, success is a journey, and we're here to help guide you every step of the way. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners like you. So join us next time, where we'll share more insights and strategies to help you succeed in your business journey. Until then, keep strategizing, keep pushing forward, and remember, your success is within reach. Thank you for listening to the Diamond View Show. See you next time.